The library is open and really needs you to get a library card because it helps them with their funding. Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Last year, I began what I did not know at the time would become an ongoing series where I would read a book, or occasionally a short story or novella that was set to be adapted, usually into a film. I would do a video on the source material, and then when the adaptation would be released, I would follow that up by doing a film review of the adaptation, which is really the main thing I do on YouTube anyway, so it all works out for me because I get to be more informed when making film reviews on adaptations if I've already read the book. I get to learn more about the adaptation process, and of course, remind everyone that tunes into these videos to support libraries. What I decided upon getting further into 2025 was that I would keep track of what books I'd read this year so that upon reaching the end of the year, not only would I do my top 10 films of the year video like everyone else does who reviews films on YouTube, but I could also present an overview of some of what I've read, the adaptations I've covered either on YouTube or Patreon, and just give a quick overview of all of those things. This year, I read 38 books. I DNF'd one book. I won't tell you which one that is, but it is on my Patreon. And I also read an interim report on Operation Canova, which was over 200 pages, so I did write that down on my reading log because of how long of a read that was, but that interim report is not something I have included in the number I've just presented of 38. First, I'm going to share some of the books I've read and done source material videos on for film adaptations that we'll be releasing in 2026. Those will be presented in sequential order according to their current release dates. Following that, I will share a list of books I've read and watched adaptations of, but also I'm going to include some films that have relevant reading where I read something that isn't necessarily source material for that film, but I would regard it as relevant reading material. This more so comes into play when the subject matter has to do with history. So oftentimes there is some sort of nonfiction reading that I would pair with the film that I had watched. Attempting to rank these proved to be complicated, particularly when I'm including works of fiction being adapted and also films about history with relevant reading material. So I will just say that that portion of the video is kind of ranked, but kind of not ranked. I don't have a precise scoring system. I am taking into consideration the material that I've read, the adapted work, and just put things where I want them to. Even if I don't rate one of those versions of the story all that favorably, if I really like the other version of the story, that could move their position in where I decided to place them. I also decided that I would cluster certain works together so that presenting that portion of the list would flow better in a way that I preferred. So that's why I'm saying it's not entirely a ranking. My criteria for rating books is similar to how I rate films. I think about how well the book is written, how much did I enjoy reading the book, and how likely or unlikely am I to read it again simply because I want to read it again. Let's begin with the source material books that I've done videos on YouTube for film adaptations that we'll be releasing in 2026. In the order of the theatrical release dates, first we have People We Meet on Vacation, which will be released on Netflix on January 9th. The book is fine. It's a slow burn friends to lovers story. I am looking forward to the film because of its casting. Emily Bader and Tom Blythe doing a rom-com? Yes, absolutely. Let me watch it. I am terribly annoyed, though, that it's not a theatrical release because I believe that those two would pop in a rom-com together on the big screen. Wuthering Heights, I had read this before, but it had been a few years, so I refreshed myself to do a source material video ahead of the latest of many Wuthering Heights film adaptations that have been made with a whitewashed Heathcliff. This new film will be released in cinemas in February. It's the 11th in international markets and the 13th in the States. And of course, it's one of the better source material books for 2026 adaptations that I've read thus far. I will be reading more of them, but for now, this is number one on the list when just judging the book. An obvious choice perhaps, but it's a classic for good reason. I did a source material video on Reminders of Him before my Wuthering Heights video because at the time, Reminders of Him had a February release date that was before Wuthering Heights, but after publishing that video, the film was moved to March 13th. I hope they slightly toned down the melodrama of the book in the film adaptation. I've seen enough of Maika Monroe's horror films to know that she's very capable of crying in character, But that doesn't mean I want to watch 2 hours of her crying the way that her character was in the book. It's very fun though that Tyriq Withers gets to play a romantic lead, and he has plenty of charisma, so I hope this goes well for him. And he gets to do a proper rom-com sometime soon because he seems like he has the perfect energy and sense of humor for that genre.
Fine, a nickel for every time I got in a fist fight during a chick flick.
Next, we have The Dog Stars, which has a film adaptation directed by the ultimate diva, Ridley Scott, releasing in cinemas on August 28th. Now, when I made this video, the release date was set for March 27th, so if you watch that video, or other videos that came after where I was mentioning this video as one of my source material videos, and I'm saying March, that's why. This was such a dad book, very different from the other source material books I've done videos on thus far, but it's Ridley Scott, so of course I had to cover it. Following that, we have Verity, which is currently set to release in cinemas on October 2nd. This was one of my least favorite books I read this year, but I am hopeful that the film adaptation could potentially elevate the material because it has Anne Hathaway and Josh Hartnett playing the married couple at the center of the story, and those two have decades of experience, and they've also wanted to work with each other for years. It's too early to know for sure if they've managed to elevate the source material since we haven't seen a trailer yet, but I really hope that they have because I think if they do, we as an audience could have a lot of fun watching it. And finally, I've also recently read Sunrise on the Reaping. The film adaptation will release in cinemas on November 20th. It's a good book. I do prefer the prequel books over the original trilogy, but overall, I'm not generally drawn to YA, so recreationally speaking, I wouldn't be as likely to reach for these simply because I prefer fiction written for adults, as well as history books. But if you are someone that likes to read YA, I would recommend the entire Hunger Games book series. The film adaptation looks promising, and I am interested in seeing more of the key figures of the rebellion and how those new actors will bring another dimension to their characters. There are 3 other source material books for 2026 adaptations that I've read and talked about on Patreon, but I won't be mentioning them in this video because those are for adaptations I'm probably not going to review on YouTube. If I do watch those adaptations though, they will probably be talked about on Patreon. Now, onto the main portion of this video for 2025 adaptations / related reading rankings. Just a reminder, in case you skipped ahead, that the list is kind of ranked, but not entirely, because sometimes I moved the order of certain things around just so that I could cluster things together in a way that made sense for the sake of the feedback being able to flow in a way that felt more organized. Moreover, the aforementioned impossibility of trying to integrate a ranking system that would cover both fictional adaptations as well as nonfiction works that are covering history. We will start at the end of the list and work our way up to the more favorable feedback. Thus, my first cluster is called End of the List. At the very last place, I have Regretting You by Colleen Hoover, and the film adaptation, which is also called Regretting You. The book was not particularly well written, nor was the story, narrative, or character work all that interesting or compelling. And then the film adaptation looked cheap and made little to no effort to modify the narrative in such a way that it might have been able to elevate the material to win over a broader movie-going audience. I have videos published on both the book and the film if you would like to hear more detailed feedback or information about what's in those stories. Above that, we have Rule by Jay Crownover and its film adaptation, Marked Men, Rule and Shaw. The book had some appealing qualities in how it intertwined the central couple together romantically, but it also had a prolonged DV aspect to the story where the female lead was being aggressively stalked by her ex, and he also violently attacked her at one point. Personally, I would rather not have to read that sort of material in a story that's first and foremost selling romance to the reader. The film removed a lot of that, which I was very happy about. I think it made a decent attempt considering how small the film's budget clearly was. It had some good qualities, all things considered, but overall it just wasn't impressive enough to be able to land a higher spot on this list. I have videos published on my channel covering both the book and the film. Above this, we have The Woman in Cabin 10 by Ruth Ware and the film adaptation of the same name. I did not make any videos on YouTube about these, but I did talk about them on Patreon, so all I will say is that these are whodunits, so I don't want to spoil the details even if I don't rate them favorably. Broadly speaking, the book was fine, not exceptional, but probably lands somewhere in the middle of the list of books I read this year if I was only rating the books and not including their adaptations. But the film, fundamentally, catastrophically, does not understand the genre that it's meant to be, so I have to put this at the end of the list. The film dragged the joint placement down. The film is only about an hour and a half, which is a terrible idea for a whodunit because you really need to take the necessary time to build tension and mystery, introduce us to the many players in the ensemble, so that we may build a pool of suspects and establish possible motives. They do nothing of the sort. Just a total waste of time for the audience. Why pay to license the book for an adaptation when you're not going to do anything with it? The next cluster is called Richard Bachman, which is a pseudonym Stephen King has used to publish some of his works. He also used this pseudonym as a means of being able to create through a different lens, so to speak. There are two sets of adaptations in this section. We have The Running Man book and film, and The Long Walk book and film. They have very similar concepts, those being a dystopian world where the protagonist competes in a contest that's used as a propaganda tool, a means of maintaining the system in place, trying to keep people at large, compliant, and under control. I don't really know how to rank these because I slightly prefer the Running Man book over the Long Walk book, but I also don't really have much interest in rereading either of them again, recreationally speaking. But I do prefer The Long Walk as a film more than the Running Man film, as the latter completely removed or glossed over the most interesting parts of the book in favor of shallow, frivolous spectacle. The Long Walk film, however, actually kept the tone and emotional core in a place that it needed to be, of maintaining the horror of the premise far better than the Running Man film did. But because of the difference across the mediums, they're fairly evenly ranked overall. The next cluster is called Strongly Disliked Reading, but One Actor Carried. First, we have The Residence, Inside the Private World of the White House by Kate Anderson Brower, and its sort of adaptation of the Netflix Whodunit limited series, The Residence. I really did not enjoy reading this book. It feels like something that is jingoistic towards the Empire, but is lacking in self-awareness about the fact that that's how it comes across. Perhaps it's simply trying to maintain a certain amount of being objective in how it shares information about what people are saying. But for me, when you tell me that you're interviewing someone that used to live in the White House and they are complaining about anti-war protesters being outside and being very loud, and you as an author don't make any mention, any comment of your stance on the issue, I'm going to look at you with at least a small amount of suspicion and skepticism. So the book is nonfiction. It's talking about people that have previously lived in and worked in the White House as part of the residence. So it's people who are doing more of the domestic jobs of the part of the White House where the first family lives. I'm not going to say that the book shouldn't exist, regardless of the fact that I did not enjoy reading it, because I do believe that history should be documented. But as for the show is merely using the book and a few details here and there from its pages about the nature of the jobs in the residence and how things run in order to build the setting for the whodunit, and the show is fine. It's not all that remarkable of a whodunit, but the main detective of the story is played by Uzo Aduba, and she was fabulous and very fun to watch. Next in this section, Caught Stealing by Charlie Houston and its film adaptation of the same name. I did videos on both of these, but for those of you who didn't watch, I really didn't like the book because there is a very long, detailed, graphic incident of animal cruelty, and to me that just says you're doing things for shock value, and I find it to be distasteful, and it adds nothing of value to the overall story or character work. The film adaptation stars Austin Butler, who is excellent, and the only reason I didn't DNF the book. I finished the book so I could cover the film because I expect a high standard when it's Austin Butler. So now, if he's announced for something, I'm automatically inclined to look more closely at what that thing is, and as long as it's not a propaganda story, then I will definitely consider reviewing it.
Gotta stop mythologizing the police, for Christ's sake, come on.
The next cluster is called She is Diva, and it has a similar premise as the previous section, actually. The difference is that I don't dislike these books with the severity of the previous section, but overall, the major selling point of both of these film adaptations is a lead actress. First up, we have The Housemaid by Frida McFadden and the film adaptation of the same name. I published YouTube videos on both of these versions of the story. The book was okay. The main excitement I had from reading that book was being able to imagine Amanda Seyfried playing Nina, and then when I watched the film adaptation, she was the absolute best part of the film, and it wasn't even close. I don't know if the film is really something that I would recommend outside of people who enjoy watching that sort of soapy erotic thriller, but despite everything else, because I had already read the book and done a source material video on it, I felt as though I needed to complete that coverage, so I went to an early press screening, and every time Amanda was on the screen, she was just acting her face off, and it was great fun to watch her do what she does best. Now, the scenes that don't have her, well, they're in the movie. And the next film in this cluster is The War of the Roses by Warren Adler and the loose film adaptation released this year called The Roses. I did not do YouTube videos on either of these, but I did talk about them over on Patreon, so I will give you a very quick explanation. The book was not written as a period piece, but it was published in 1981, which is over 40 years ago, so reading it now makes it feel like a period piece. This new film is set in present day. Moreover, the book is a drama, whereas the film is a dramedy. The main book couple are Americans, whereas their film counterparts are Brits who spend most of their story in America. And broadly speaking, both stories are about a married couple who decide to get divorced, and things begin to escalate quickly. The book isn't bad, but it's not really a fun subject to read about. It's more of a tragedy where you read about these two people spiraling. It's competent for its concept, but it's not necessarily something I would reread recreationally. The film, however, has Olivia Colman as the female lead, and she is hilarious. She's so much fun to watch, and she's the reason I decided to watch the film, and I did laugh on multiple occasions. The next cluster is called The Hunger Games, so it should be fairly self-explanatory what's going to be in here. I read all 5 Hunger Games books by Suzanne Collins, and I rewatched the first 4 films that were adapted from the original book trilogy. I have not done videos about the first 4 books and their adaptations, but I did talk about all of these stories on Patreon as I was making my way through the material to prepare to eventually read Sunrise on the Reaping and do the source material video on that, which, as I've already said, is now live on my channel. I'm going to put the original set of stories first because I don't really like the films enough to want to rewatch those recreationally. Now, there are specific scenes that I'm open to looking up to rewatch, but overall, the films are just not strong enough for what the subject matter they're aiming to address is, and the books are significantly better than their film adaptations. It was a downgrade to go from reading the book trilogy for the first time to rewatching those films for the first time in many years because of how much interesting lore, world building, and other details were removed from those film adaptations. Also, certain casting choices were questionable, and we will leave it at that. Above these stories, I would put The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes because I found the material to be a lot more interesting, and young Coriolanus Snow is evil. You read this book, and you will read him thinking one thing, and then he says the exact opposite. He's a duplicitous, conniving menace, which does make for really great storytelling. I don't like him, I'm not rooting for him, but it was more mature overall because of the fact that he's not an innocent YA protagonist that you're rooting for. And again, for anyone who needs the reminder, I don't really have an interest in reading YA for my own recreation, so there's already a built-in distance when I approach these stories, but I like to read them for the research, for the knowledge. I didn't rewatch the film adaptation simply because it wasn't available on streaming alongside the original set of films, which is how I was able to rewatch those, but I did see the film adaptation during its theatrical release, which wasn't that long ago, so it's still fairly fresh enough in my memory to feel fine with pairing it with the book, and placing it here on this list above the original book trilogy and its 4 film adaptations. The next cluster is called Read the Book. So this is when we are getting our first major shift into nonfiction reading. I know we had one nonfiction book already on this list, but the adaptation was one that heavily repurposed the book to create a work of fiction, so it's not really the same. These are films about historical figures, and the through line of both is that I would much rather emphasize that you should read the relevant reading and go directly to the source to learn what you need to know. Films about historical events can absolutely be important ways of broadcasting the subject matter to a larger audience, but I would like to encourage you to jump ahead to what should come after that introduction, which is to read and learn about that history in a way that is less repurposed, the way that it has to be to make a feature film. So the first thing I have in this section is the film Marighella, which I did review here on YouTube. I wasn't able to learn as much as I had hoped about Carlos Marighella, the Afro-Brazilian revolutionary, by watching this film. So I would recommend that you read the mini manual of the Urban Guerrilla, which was written by Carlos Marighella himself. It was excellent, and it really did a lot of heavy lifting in jumpstarting a lot of my reworking what I was planning on prioritizing reading, where I made a decision that yes, actually, I would rather set aside more time to read nonfiction books, books about history, and those have been a lot more interesting than a fair few of the fictional source material books I've read this year. Moving up now, we have Judas and the Black Messiah. This film is about Fred Hampton, and in particular, they put a lot of focus on the informant, William O'Neill, and his role in the larger scheme to bring down Fred Hampton specifically, and more broadly speaking, the Black Panthers and other revolutionaries. It is a good film, but when I watched it, I was already in the middle of reading this book on Fred Hampton that was written by Jeffrey Haas. Jeffrey Haas is a lawyer, and in 1969, he and 3 other lawyers set up the People's Law Office, which represented the Black Panthers and other political activists. He knew Fred Hampton as a result. This book was one of the best things I read all year. No work of fiction made me feel all that I felt when reading this. I recommend pairing this book with the 1971 documentary about Fred Hampton and what happened to him. Together, that's a much better way of learning about what the feature film is talking about. Now, again, I want to emphasize that I don't think the film is bad. You need to have more accessible introductions like these, something that can reach a wider audience. But I heavily implore you to read this book and watch the documentary because it just doesn't compare. When it comes to history, you have to study the details, and feature films are not as conducive to doing that because they have to abide by certain conventions of the medium. They have to present an arc, narratively, and for the characters, whereas things like history books and documentaries are more likely and able to give you those details. The next cluster on this list is called Stephen King because these are adaptations of Stephen King books that were written and published under the Stephen King name. First up, we have It by Stephen King, which is now, out of all of the Stephen King works I've read this year, the one that I would rate the highest if we're just talking about the book. Oftentimes in the stories I've read by him, there's a tendency to stay in one character's point of view. With It, though, the story moves around through the perspectives of many different characters. It's over 1,100 pages long and is truly a monumental achievement for how detailed the material is and how much it develops the characters and lore. I rewatched both adaptations this year, those being the 1990 television event and the duology released in cinemas more recently, and then I also watched the prequel series Welcome to Derry. I talked about some of my feedback on all of these in more detail on Patreon, but to just touch on a couple of things, both of the direct adaptations are highly memorable for the exceptional work of the Pennywise actors. However, both of those adaptations cut out a lot of material, which is understandable considering how long the book is. But something that both of these versions have in common, which I'm not a fan of, is that they both considerably reduce the material for Mike Hanlon. There is so much more information about him, his family, his encounters with it, that it does make me think less of both of those adaptations now that I'm aware of how much they took away from him specifically. As for Welcome to Derry, my feedback is mixed. The parts that are done well are truly excellent, but that just makes the weaker parts stand out even more. Oftentimes, it's things like highly clockable VFX, but considering how much the direct adaptations of it have sidelined Mike Hanlon, it was refreshing to see this story put his family in the spotlight. They also made good use of the longer runtime of a television series in order to flesh out more of the lore and cover things from the book that are usually not included, such as the black spot. I knew what was coming with that. As soon as they had those men entering that space, they hadn't even fixed it up yet. They didn't even call it the black spot at that point, but I already knew how it was going to end and that it would hurt to see it all play out. I'm also glad that they included so many indigenous characters because in the book, the Losers Club attempt to do a sort of indigenous ritual that allows the members who are able to stay in the smoke for the longest to see the very beginning of it on Earth when he first crash landed. It makes sense that they would be the ones that have had to deal with it for the longest because it's their land and their home, no matter what anyone else tries to claim or impose. If there's a season 2, I will watch. They will probably show how that car got shot up. That was another thing from the book during one of the earlier cycles of it. Next up, we have Skeleton Crew by Stephen King, which is a collection of short stories containing the monkey, which is the source material for the film adaptation of the same name. I made videos on both of these versions. I really love what Osgood Perkins did with this story. He infused so much humor and heart into his adaptation that elevated the source material by quite a lot. Also, Tatiana Maslany is always fun to watch because she's incredible at what she does. Next, we have If It Bleeds by Stephen King, which is another collection of shorts, but this time it includes The Life of Chuck, which is the source material of the film adaptation of the same name. I did videos on both of these. The film was written and directed by Mike Flanagan, who also did Dr. Sleep, which is probably my favorite film that's based on a Stephen King work, though I haven't read that book yet. The Life of Chuck was a very underrated gem from this year. It's emotionally gripping in a way that is quintessential Mike Flanagan. You know when he makes something new? It will probably make you cry. I don't want to give away too much if you haven't read or seen this story, but if you're going to watch the film and you haven't read the story beforehand, I highly recommend rewatching the film so that you can pick up on certain details that you might have missed the first time. The next section is called,
or as we say in Ireland.
I had wanted to watch the Say Nothing miniseries ever since I saw Lola Pettigrew's acceptance speech at the IFTAs, and all I could think in response was, who is this icon?
The first step in moving on and moving forward would be providing some decent mental health services, investing in youth services, and a proper standard of living for all working class people in the north. Thank you, and free Palestine.
But I didn't know if I would be able to watch it because I don't have that streaming platform and I will not pay for it. I found myself in a situation where I was at someone else's home and they had it, so I watched it immediately. And it was one of the best shows I've ever seen. So naturally, I had to go get the book from the local library. There were things that couldn't make the cut, like all of the material about the 2 hunger strikes, the second of which is the more famous one, as it was led by Bobby Sands. So this is why I'm going to include the Say Nothing series and book, the Steve McQueen film Hunger, which is about Bobby Sands and the 1981 hunger strike, and I'm also going to include Ed Maloney's book, A Secret History of the IRA, because it covers a lot of the earlier history in more detail than what Say Nothing did. It was also a good follow-up to Say Nothing because Ed Maloney was the one who conducted a lot of the interviews that are referenced throughout the Say Nothing book and series, so it just fleshes everything out in further detail. The next cluster is called Fierce Fiction. Now, these are some of the best of what I've read and watched this year that are fictional books and their film adaptations, and both of those I rate highly. First, we have Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton and Bong Joon-ho's film adaptation Mickey 17. The book has a lot of extra world building because Mickey is a historian, which isn't really a profession that exists anymore because the information is just available online and anyone can look it up. That's a very underrated dystopian detail, but anyway, Book Mickey will tell these stories about other planets and they don't make the cut into the film adaptation because films have to abide by a runtime. And an uninitiated audience, unfamiliar with the source material, might question why those details are there if they don't have a more immediate reason to be there, to directly serve the main storyline that's unfolding. As for Bong Joon-ho's film, it has a lot more humor and romanticism, both qualities that I enjoy. Therefore, I rate both versions of the story well. Next, we have Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, who also co-wrote the screenplay for the film adaptation of the same name. Both of these are among the very best of this year. Hamnet is probably my favorite fictional book I've read this year. There is a close second that I will mention in just a bit. It creates an ambiance. It treats nature as something sacred. It's profound, emotionally gripping, and visceral. And I was so impressed with how well the film brings a lot of those same qualities to the big screen. The film also has the added bonus of Jessie Buckley's exceptional performance. If she doesn't sweep for Best Actress all awards show season, then what's the point of those shows? Because it certainly won't be to award the best of the best. This film is devastating, but life-affirming. It's a love letter to family, art, and nature. 5 stars for both. And speaking of 5 stars for both the book and the film, we have Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, by Mary Shelley, and Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. I had already read this book before, but it had been a while, so I reread it in addition to watching this film 6 times at the cinema and 0 times on streaming, because who do you think you're talking to? Criterion. Release this on physical media. Hurry up. The girls are waiting. I reviewed the films for both Hamnet and Frankenstein, and they're both quite recent to be released, so it feels almost redundant to try to explain why both of them are as exceptional as they are. I feel like I've already done that. Frankenstein, the book, is a seismic classic. The impact it has had on science fiction is immeasurable. It's a classic that truly lives up to its hype. And Guillermo del Toro did an incredible job choosing the best actors to play these characters, to infuse the story with his mighty Mexican heart. The way that he talks about this violence within the family unit and the ways that that can fester, how important it is to break the cycle, as well as just the entire press tour of him trash-talking AI, spreading so much love for filmmaking as an art form, having these giant sets and props built. Every bit of that needs to be in a museum. This is one of the best films I've seen this year, and I cannot say enough good things about it. And the final cluster I want to mention, it's something I saved for last because of how much more I've gotten into reading nonfiction writing this year, so I wanted to put something historical at the end of the video. Thus we have The Wind That Shakes the Barley, one of the best films I've seen this year. Released in 2006, this film stars Cillian Murphy and Liam Cunningham. The story is a fictional one, but it's a means of giving the audience a window into the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, which took place immediately thereafter. There is a scene where Cillian Murphy and Liam Cunningham's characters officially meet for the first time, and one of the ways that they bond with each other is they quote James Connolly, and the quote that they said was such a banger that I went, well, hold on, who said that? Tell me more. So I looked it up. It was James Connolly. So I read the James Connolly Reader that's edited by Sean Harkin, and that was one of the best things I read all year. If you're new to reading that, it's a collection of James Connolly's writings, but before then, there is a fairly thorough overview of his life and work that pulls various quotes and excerpts from Connolly's writings and puts those in the context of the broader historical ongoings within Ireland in particular, but sometimes more internationally speaking. So it goes a long way in helping the reader to better understand why he felt compelled to write the things that he wrote. So those are some of my thoughts on books I read and films that I watched this year, be they adaptations or relevant associated reading material. Let me know what some of your favorite or least favorite adaptations were this year, or perhaps the adaptations you're most anticipating for the 2026 season. Right now for adaptations, my most anticipated for next year is probably The Dog Stars, at least of the ones I can think of quickly off the top of my head. I didn't love the book, but Ridley Scott is doing the adaptation, so of course that will automatically get my attention and pique my interest. For nonfiction, I really want to watch In the Name of the Father, but if I'm remembering correctly, the last time I checked, my local library didn't have Jerry Conlon's autobiography, which of course I want to read alongside that viewing, but I will have to look again and see if I can perhaps request it to come from a different library. I'm not entirely sure what sort of access there is. It's been a while since I last searched for it. Worst case scenario, I will just order the book. I prefer to borrow books from the library, but we will see what my options are. Happy New Year, happy reading, and happy viewing. Support your local library. If you already have your library card, well then go borrow something, because borrowing things also helps the libraries.
And England will still rule you through our landlords, capitalists, and commercial institutions.
It's my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, me too.